All right, on to evaluating causal hypotheses. So in the last lecture, we basically set up like our account of what causation is for us. Like what is it for a causal variable to have an effect in an individual, if that individual is deterministic or probabilistic, and then what is it for a causal variable to have an effect on a population, and then since it's difficult actually to sort of determine an individual's like complete residual state, which you kind of need if you want to say for sure whether there's an effect or not. We worked up a way of using a population, right, to determine whether there is in fact whether a causal variable has an effect in an individual, be that deterministic, probabilistic, and so on, right? So that's all sort of the conceptual machinery, the background. So now we're going to get into actually evaluating causal hypotheses. This lecture, we're going to focus on randomized experimental trials. And then in the next lecture, which I believe is Wednesday, right? Isn't Monday's a holiday? That will then be on two other experimental designs that you can use if you can't do. So this one we're talking about today is kind of the gold standard. If you can, you want to do this kind, but often you can't, and there are some other designs you can use that are less good evidence, right, for a causal hypothesis, but often can be used and can provide evidence as well for a causal hypothesis. So as far as course stuff, right, I made an announcement in Canvas, so hopefully you saw that, which is that the homework for Chapter 7 deadline's being extended a little bit because it seemed like you had like a deadline, like it was like Monday and then another deadline Wednesday, so I pushed the Wednesday one to Friday. And the other sort of big thing is it's like the same number of chapters, right, for each exam, right, 4 chapters each, but somehow like the second set of 4 is really pretty dense. And so I want to count for that, sort of somehow make it sort of more manageable. And so without sort of radically altering the syllabus, the solution I came to was to change the exam from trying to approximate in class by restricting the amount of time you have to like a few hours to just making it totally take home and giving you like the whole weekend to work. Right? So it's always obviously sort of technically open book. You're remote, right? So by all means, use your book, use your notes. But here you're not even really restricted by time. It's going to be the same sort of exam I would have given you in class. So I'm not like making it harder, but I think you're going to want to like, because there's so much information being presented, I think you'll want to make use of your book and of your notes and of the lecture slides and the lecture. And I think they'll give you a better shot at doing well on the exam. And, again, the exam, the plan is not to try to trick you with very like precise stuff. The point is to see that you understand the important concepts. So it was never really the case that like being open book is like the exam questions are typically not something you can just sort of like search in a PDF and just like whatever copy and paste the answer, right? They're just more sort of like general questions, right? But I think having those resources will be helpful to you. All right, any questions, feel free to email me or catch me in office hours. Oh, they're starting now. I gotta stop this. I will continue this in a moment. I gotta hop in office hours. All right. Okay, it is 12 hours later. I'm wearing different clothes since the last slide. I take a break, do office hours, and then lots of stuff happened. Okay, so yeah, here is sort of the example of the study that we're going to use for this lecture. Will give us an example of a randomized experimental trial, right? So the this one, as I said, is considered the best, right? And we'll think of this rat story as sort of an analog model to use as a guide for sort of evaluating other cases where you have sort of maybe there's different details or whatever, but this is our guiding example for this sort of trial. So what's the story? So in 1977, right, the FDA, they find out about this study in Canada on rats and appeared to show that saccharin, which was in Sweet and Low, I think it still is, right? It's not like illegal or anything now. Um, now they have new ones, NutraSweet, and they have a million sweeteners. At the time, this was kind of the main one, saccharin. So, anyways, they find out about this study, right, that it causes cancer in lab rats. So the FDA issues a temporary or preliminary ban on saccharin. This was obviously very distressing to companies that sell saccharin, right? So they were very against it. So what they had to do was review this study, right? Make sure it's good, um, and then decide sort of what to do about it, right? So what ended up happening was they reviewed the study, they found it was good, but they found that they didn't need to actually, in the end, ban saccharin. They just put a warning label on it. So we'll walk through the whole story, right? But it's a good study of an example of how to evaluate a causal hypothesis, right? Pardon me. So you can read that whole excerpt. It's on page 209, right? But here's me summarizing what they said in even sort of less detail than a summary of the summary. Um, so the best evidence that they found for the causal hypothesis that saccharin is a positive causal factor for bladder cancer came from this report in what they call two-generation rat feeding experiments, and we'll explain what we mean by two-generation in a moment. So if you're using rats as a proxy for humans, right, to try and figure out if a substance is dangerous or poses a risk of cancer, um, the rats have to get it the same way humans get it, right? So if it's something that humans eat, then the rats need to eat it. You can't just inject them, and you can't even force feed them, right? This is just sort of the rule for these sorts of things. Now, of course, rats are very different from people. An obvious thing, they're very, very much smaller than people are. But we have a long history, right, of studying um, carcinogens in particular, medications, all sorts of things, testing them on rats first before we test them in humans. Um, and the success of these sorts of studies over the long run kind of confirms that this is a decent inference to make in many cases, right? That if it's uh, unhealthy in rats or if it's effective in rats, you can kind of say that it's probably fine. It probably does the same thing to humans. So how did this particular study work? So they fed saccharin actually to two generations of rats. So um, the first generation, as soon as they were weaned from their mothers, right, they stopped drinking milk and could eat, gave them, they started giving them saccharin, right? And then those rats who were fed saccharin after weaning, their offspring were also fed saccharin after weaning. Um, but those children, right, also got the saccharin from their rat mothers while they were in the womb and while they were nursing, right? So the members of the second generation then were examined for cancer upon natural death or sacrifice after two years of the experiment. Right? So either they die or after 2 years they cut them open and look for cancer. Um, why do you need two generations? Uh, Rats don't live as long as humans either, right? I mean, you think about sort of cancerous substances in humans, right? Like smoking, like you smoke for like decades, right? Before you, so they need to test this a bit faster, right? So we'll also notice that they're going to feed them quite a bit of saccharin, right? And then by getting it to them in the womb, right, they can hopefully produce tumors over the lifetime of a rat, right, which is much shorter. Okay, so for each experiment, right, the first generation and the second generation, um, there was also a control group that did not ingest saccharin, right? So, and the simple answer to what happened is that compared to the control group, the saccharin-fed animals definitely had more bladder tumors, right? Um, we'll get at the statistical data in a moment, right, to see make sure it's significant and whatnot. But it was considered sufficient evidence for the claim that saccharin causes cancer in rats, right? Um, so we'll look at the table in a moment, right? But cancers were only actually found in the rats that received the most saccharin, right? So 5% of their diet was saccharin. Um, their measure of statistical significance in this report is a p-value, which is slightly different than what we've been doing, right? But it's basically a measure of how likely it would be that you could get that same result purely by chance, right? If you run the same experiment, right, 100 times, you'll have some variation, right? Just by pure chance, a rat might get a tumor. It's possible by pure chance a bunch of rats could get tumor, right? Even if it had nothing to do with the saccharin. So a p-value tells you how likely it is that you can get that result by chance, and what you typically want is a p-value of less than 0.05, less than a 5% chance that this would just be random variation, right? So they actually didn't find statistical significance in the first generation of rats, right? There was a difference, but not a statistically significant one. So the saccharin-fed rats did have more tumors, but not, right? There's not enough of a difference to say that it couldn't be sort of chance. But in the second generation, it was definitely. So here's the actual table, right? So parental, right? So that's the first generation offspring. That's the second generation. We see the control group with a dose of 0% saccharin in their diet and experimental group with 5% saccharin in their diet. Notice that far more cases in males, right, than in females. So in the first generation, looks like there were seven, right, cancers found in the experimental group, one in the control group, right? So that difference, 6 more cancers in the experimental group, was not quite enough for statistical significance. But then if you look at the second generation, right, you've got 12 males with cancer compared to 0 offspring, 2 females with cancer compared to 0 offspring. So much bigger difference, and that was statistically significant at the 0.003 level, right? So very significant. So as we noted, right, the cancers are more frequent in males than in females. They didn't really know how to explain this and didn't try to. In humans, bladder cancers are also more frequent in males. We've always kind of assumed that the difference was because males tend to work in sort of different sorts of industries. There you've got a guy working in asbestos, right? That causes cancer. I don't think it causes bladder cancer, but smoker, right? More men are smokers, stuff like that, right? There's lots of reasons that men might get more cancers. Um, but none of those, interestingly, right, none of those explanations would apply to the rats, right? So there must be something else going on there with the male rats, but they would need to do another study to figure out what. So, in conclusion, the 2-generation experiment showed that saccharin caused an increase in bladder cancer in second-generation animals, especially among males. In the first generation, the result fell just short of statistical significance. Again, they calculated a p-value on their own, and you can, in general, believe it, right? If it's published like in a good journal, they didn't. It's unlikely they made any math errors, right? There is controversy about p-values, right? But for our purposes, uh, as sort of non-specialists, um, if they say statistically significant, right, then we can believe it. And we can even run our own version of the numbers, right? They did give us the relative frequencies there, so we can run our version of the test for the statistical significance as well, right? But if they say it is significant, particularly the 0.003 level, then you can trust them, right? Okay. So yeah, no other cancer site been associated with saccharin, so right, just bladder cancer. So this study, right, that's just sort of the summary of what happened, right? We haven't quite evaluated it. We haven't run the evaluation yet. That's just sort of description of the study. So that sort of study is what we call a randomized experimental design. RED. Do we call? I don't know that I use that abbreviation in the rest of this, but that's what it means. So we'll start with a method of evaluating these sorts of designs, and then once we've got that figured out, in the next lecture we'll talk about some other sorts of designs and evaluating those. So you'll want to look at the real world population of interest, right? So now ultimately it's got to be humans, right? That's why we're running this. Someone out there might be interested in cancer in rats, but the vast majority of the public, and the reason you might use this as a pretext to ban soda or put a label on soda is because it's supposed to apply to humans, right? Um, but the only population they actually sample is lab rats, right? So strictly speaking, our statistical methods only permit a conclusion about rats, right? We can make an estimation from the sample back to the population, but that's all rats. So obviously there's an inference to humans implicit in here somewhere, but it's kind of a separate issue than our sort of statistical model, right? The causal variable, ingestion of saccharin, right? Effect variable, occurrence of bladder cancer. Causal hypothesis is that ingesting saccharin is a positive causal factor for bladder cancer in laboratory rats. And as we've seen, right, in the last lecture when we talked about our sort of understanding what we mean by these causal hypotheses, it's saying that more cases of bladder cancer would be present in the population if all members were exposed to saccharin, right, than if none were. Remember, those are our two populations, X and K, right? X where everyone gets the saccharin, and K where no one gets the saccharin. And to say that saccharin is a positive causal factor is to say that in the K group, there's going to be more cancer than in the X group, there's going to be more cancer than in the K group. Right? You can think of X experimental, right? K control is a K. Okay, so in our evaluation, so we're first starting to do the evaluation, but we're not giving you the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Later you'll get the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But right now we're doing all the stuff we will eventually be doing. So you'll get it twice. So you'll want to look at the data, right? We've already sort of looked at it. Here's the table again, right? But in your evaluation, you're going to go through it in some more detail, right? So in the first generation, the sample size, right? 74 rats that got no saccharin, 78 that got a diet of 5% saccharin. So of those 78, 7 got bladder cancer. Of the 74 controls, only 1. Right? So experimental design. So as we've said, right, a causal hypothesis is actually about two hypothetical populations, right? It says you take the population U, right, and you say, what if in one world they all got the causal factor, in another world none of them got them? So how do we replicate that sort of hypothetical situation in real life? Well, all we do, as they did with these rats, you take real samples and make them play the roles of the hypothetical population. So you randomly sample from the real population, and then you just divide that sample in two, also randomly, right? And then take one of the groups, call it the experimental group, and make them live in the world where they all get saccharin, right? And then take the other group, we'll call them the control group, and make them live in the world where they get no saccharin. Right? So here's the diagram. So there's the real population in the gray box, right? And then X and K are these hypothetical populations that we were talking about before, right? So, right, the control group, as I said, we put them in the condition of the K population, right? It doesn't get the causal factor at all. So maybe that's intuitive why that's equivalent, right, to the hypothetical populations, um, right? Or like having two actual populations that resemble the hypothetical populations and sampling from them, right? Instead, what we're doing is we're sampling from one population and dividing them into two groups. So the question is, why is that equivalent? Well, maybe it's obvious, and I partly worry that their explanation here is more complicated than than it needs to be, right? But okay, say you take all the rats, right, and for each one you flipped a coin, right? So just one population. Say you for the whole population, you flip a coin to determine whether it gets saccharin or not, right? So 50% of the rats are getting saccharin, right? Then you could sample from that population, right? And then you'd ended up in the same situation as ours experiment, where a random sample and half get saccharin and half don't, right? So what we actually do, right, we take a random sample of the population and then divide it into two. It's basically equivalent from creating the hypothetical population and sampling from those. Okay, the lab rats are they're bred specifically to resemble rats in the actual population of actual rats, right? So that inference is fair enough. And what you'll end up with is two observed relative frequencies of rats with bladder cancer, right? So the frequency in X of the effect and the frequency in K of the effect. So let's look at the figures here. So again, on the left, we've got our model where we got the real population and we got our hypothetical populations. And what we actually do is we have randomly sampled 152 rats from the real population, and then we divided it again randomly into two groups, one all of which get saccharin, the other none of which get saccharin. 78 in the X group and 74 in the control group. And now we've got our relative frequencies. So the frequency of X, right, the frequency of the effect in the X group is 7 out of 78, and in the control group, 1 out of 74. Again, this is the first generation of rats. So notice, right, that we had a random process twice here. The randomness came in at two stages. First, the first sample from the actual population, that's got to be random, right? So you don't want to just be picking rats from like that live near a toxic waste site or something like that, or that are otherwise eating an abnormal diet. So they want to, again, you can go back to sort of the definitions of randomness, right? But it should be that any rat has an equal chance of getting sampled, and that there should be no sort of correlations, right? And then second, the division of the group into the experimental control should also be random, right? So you don't want to like divide it into all males and all females, or like divide it by weight or something, with the healthier rats in one group and the sicker ones in the other. Now notice the OTA report doesn't mention any of that stuff, right? But this is the sort of thing that in a published study, it's been through peer review, you can pretty much assume it, right? And as an aside, I'll probably bring this up in the review session for the exam. When is well, good to know before. So if any of you are thinking of writing on the second topic on the essay, right, you'll notice that not a causal thing. This is from like previous 2 chapters ago, where we're just talking about statistical hypotheses about a correlation in the population. I've simplified it a bit. Like one of the things in the book they worry about a lot is like how well, right, does this sampling method approximate random sampling? And they come up with all kinds of reasons why it might not be, right? You may recall, right, the sample of school children and how they said, well, if you're homeschooled, right, maybe you wouldn't get sampled and so on and so on. The purpose of the essay, that is totally simplified, and I just stipulate that it's random sampling, right? That's to make, if you choose that second essay topic, to just make that easier for you, right? And you will find later on, right, in a study like this, lots of times you can just sort of assume, okay, it's random enough. We'll see actually as we get into the other experimental designs, it starts to become more of a worry again, right? But for the purpose of a random, right, experimental design, if it's published, it's probably random. But yeah, and for the essay, I say it's random. Just you can take my word for it and say, yeah, that part of it's good. Right. Attendance quiz, attendance quiz. Type this into your browser. Okay, and I'm gonna figure you've got it in there by now. Moving on. Okay. So figure 8.3, which my head is over a little bit, diagram of the data from the first part of the saccharin experiment. So notice it looks a whole lot like the sort of diagram we'd use to evaluate the existence of a correlation between two variables, right? Pardon me. In this case, one variable is the cause variable, right? Presence or absence of saccharin in the diet, which characterizes the two groups. So we got the experimental group and the K group. And then the second variable is the effect variable, and that's going to be the occurrence or not of bladder cancer. So we have 9% in the experimental group, and then I think it's 1% in the control group. Right? So you could run this, right? So again, they use p-values, and they just sort of tell you it's not statistically significant. But you could also take those sample sizes and look up your look in your tables, and you would also come to the conclusion that this is not going to be significant, right? There's going to be some overlap. We'll get into that a bit later. But yeah, these are the two relative frequencies. So is there a statistically significant difference, right, between the relative frequencies? We're going to determine that, right, by using those relative frequencies to work backwards to the population, estimate the values of the probability of the effect in X and the probability of the effect in K in the population. So we got to find the intervals, right? And there's the equation, right? So the probability of the effect in X will be the relative frequency of the effect in X plus or minus the margin of error. Same for the probability of the effect in K. And if the intervals don't overlap, you got a statistically significant difference, which is good evidence for the existence of a causal relationship between the cause and effect variables. Right? Very similar to the correlation stuff, right? Oh, so the math is basically identical, right? It's all in the experimental design, right? If the intervals do overlap, the difference between the relative frequencies is not statistically significant, which means that there is not good evidence for a difference in the probabilities in the population, which in turn fails to be good evidence for a causal relationship. So if there is overlap, right, you'll say there's no evidence for a causal relationship. Now that is different from saying that there is evidence for no causal relationship. Now overlap just means, right, that there might be no, right, like the evidence is consistent with there being no causal relationship. It's also consistent with there being, a relatively low level of effectiveness, some causal relationship, but not a very effective one, right? So you have to be careful with your phrasing, right? It's just you don't have evidence for a causal relationship, but it's not evidence that there's none whatsoever. There might be a little bit. Estimating effectiveness, it's again same math as estimating the strength of a correlation. Right, you take the farthest ends, calculate the difference between those, and then the nearest ends, if you got your intervals, calculate the difference between those, and that interval will then be the actual strength of the correlation lies somewhere in that interval. Right? I think I said strength of correlation, but the effectiveness of the causal relationship. Okay. So if you look up, right, your margin of error for a sample of the 78, you're looking at roughly 12% margin of error. So definitely the intervals overlap, right? You got 9% and 1%. Now, if we used a slightly different confidence interval, so if we weren't shooting for 95% confidence and we just pulled it back a little bit to 92.5, then you would have a significant result, right? You want to end up with looks like a margin of error, right, of 4% or less, right? At 4%, they'd sort of meet around 5%. So just, I guess, a reminder that these claims are all assuming that we're shooting for 95% confidence level. But you could always sort of, if you want to be less confident, then your margin of error will shrink. Right? But typically, 95% is going to be our default. Okay, having done that with the real example, here is the program, right? There's sort of like the format that your homework and your exam. So step one, what is the real world population and what is the causal hypothesis? So, right, identify the real world population actually sampled. Here's a good point where you might note any important differences between the population actually sampled and the population of interest. It is important that, in this case, that the population of interest is humans and the population actually sampled is rats, right? You want to identify the cause variable and the effect variable, and then state the causal hypothesis, right? Their hypothesis that there's a positive causal relationship between X and Y, something like that. Okay, so that's step one. Step two, the data. So identify the real world samples and the particular data they found from those samples, right? What were the relative frequencies of the property of interest in the two samples. Be sure to give the sample sizes if they have it, right? If they give it to you. Step three, identify the design of the experiment. So here's where we haven't seen other designs yet, right? But so for right now, the only design you know about is the randomized experimental trial, right? So if you're talking about this rat experiment, that's what you would say here, and explain why you think that's the best model for this sort of experiment, right? Why in the rat case is the best model? Well, they've taken, right, a random sample and then randomly divided it into two groups and then manipulated those groups, right, by applying the causal factor to all the individuals in one group and none in the other group. That's pretty clearly a experimental trial. You're doing a manipulation. You're taking these groups and actually doing something to them. It's going to be fairly obvious, right? If you're studying smoking in humans, right, you're going to have to do a different kind of trial. You're not going to take a group of humans and make them smoke. Okay, step four. So how well does the random sampling model represent the actual process by which the sample was selected from the population? And you can, a range of answers: very well, moderately well, somewhat well, not very well. Again, in this sort of design, it's going to be very well, right? The randomized experimental trial does a great job of estimating random sampling. Issues, there could be issues, right? So, right, does every rat in the population have the same probability of being chosen? Well, no, these are bred, right, for labs. So you might state that part is not satisfied, but they're specifically bred in a way to resemble wild rats very well, right? So that's an issue of randomness, right, that they're aware of and that they deal with. And then as far as sort of any correlations in the population, again, right, so long as they're not sort of like sickly or right, you don't, as long as they're randomly divided. So again, a lot of this, if you're reading this from a journal, they may not even get into the specifics of this, and you kind of have to just assume. But that's some of the things you might say in this case. Step five, evaluating the hypothesis. So here's where you sort of run the numbers, right? Is there a significant, right? Is there evidence, right, for the causal hypothesis? Meaning, is the difference between the relative frequencies or the estimations in the you take the relative frequencies, right? You apply the margin of error so that you have an estimation of the probabilities in the population. Is there overlap? Is there not? Right? Calculate the effectiveness. That's where you do all that math. And then finally, take a moment to just, in the light of all your answers from the previous steps, give a summary of how well, right, you think the data supports the causal hypothesis, right? So, very strong support, somewhat strong, not very strong. Note the various factors supporting your answer. So the fact that this is a randomized experimental design, which is kind of the best kind, that'll count. Right? How effective was the causal factor, and so on. All the things that contribute to your answer there. You may find it helpful to draw out the boxes, right? If you're really good at the math and you just want to use the rule of thumb calculations that we have, that's fine too, but definitely helpful to draw out the boxes. So like when you do step 1, draw a box representing the population sampled, right? And you might have a larger box either above or around it, right, that represents the actual population of interest, and write anything you want. If you're, visualizing it all may also help you think of like different factors like, oh, is this really random? Is this population, is the sample, really the best sort of sample? Does it reflect the population at large, or is there any differences and stuff like that? It may help you think through those issues. When you do step 2, add smaller boxes off to the right, representing the samples. You can label those boxes with the data, right? The relative frequencies, sample sizes, and stuff like that. Step 3, connect the boxes and label the sort of design that's being used in the study. Step 5, you can use, right? You've got the boxes, now you can sort of draw out the intervals and do your calculations. It's helpful to think with your hand on paper, right? And to get it all out there. Trying to do it all in your head can be rough, even with relatively simple calculations like this. So, not required, right? But you may find it useful. If you do a neat job of it and want to put that on the exam, great. That helps us as well, right? Again, you can get a perfect score without doing the diagrams, but it can be helpful, right? And we'll take a look at them. Right, so here's an example of one such completed diagram, right? So you've got the gray box, just the population of lab rats, right? So here the actual population, they're taking to be just lab rats, right? Which means they're restricting the hypothesis to just lab rats. And that solves the issue of whether lab rats are representative of the greater population of rats in the world, right? So that's one way to do it. So through a random process, there's a sample of 183, right? We see the little box there, and then it's split into 2 groups, and you've labeled the numbers of each group, 94 and 89, and which is the X, which is K, what are the conditions they get. Again, little arrows to point out that process is also random, and then you can jot down your relative frequencies that you find, point out that it is statistically significant. Right? This one is, I believe, from the second experiment. That one was statistically significant. So let's walk through that actual evaluation of that second generation experiment. So again, these were the rats whose parents were, whose mothers were fed saccharin for their whole, from weaning till death, and so these rats were exposed to saccharin from conception for the rest of their lives, or at least for 2 years until they were killed. Okay, so step 1, what's the real world population and what's the causal hypothesis? So the population sampled consisted of rats bred for laboratory experiments. Causal variable, ingestion of saccharin. Effect variable, bladder cancer, all of this, right, the same as the first generation experiment. The hypothesis at issue is that ingestion of saccharin is a positive causal factor for bladder cancer in a population of lab rats. Here is a good time maybe to note that the population sampled is not humans, right? But kind of supposed to be relevant to humans, and there's a little gap there. Okay, step 2, what's the data? Well, the overall data is that, here it's a kind of up to you to decide how much detail you want to go into with data. This seems to be about right, complete enough, right? So they don't break it down into males and females, because it ends up in the conclusion is not sort of relative. It's interesting, why all males? But that's not really anything that they get into or anything they were looking at. So you can sort of skip that breakdown. So this is a little open to interpretation, right? What is the relevant data that's worth putting in here, and what can you leave out? So here they just say, look, the control group, right? 14 of the 94 got bladder cancer, 15%. And in the control group, 0 out of 89 cases. The experimental group. Yeah. 15% in the experimental group, 0% in the control group. Okay, so step 3, what was the design? Well, the experiment fits the model for randomized experimental design. Why? Well, the sample from the population was randomly divided into 2 groups. One got the causal factor, right, and one didn't. Okay, step 4, random sampling. And here they basically say, yeah, right, it's a randomized experimental design. It's a professional study reviewed by the OTA. Right, it got through peer review. It's probably the good, right, on that point. Step 5, now we evaluate, right? So um, here that now the study has evaluated it for you, right? They're using p-values, which is again slightly different than what we're doing, right? You can trust that they've done their math, right? That's something that would definitely get caught in the peer review process, right? And folks that allowed their paper to get published know much more about statistics than you and I probably do, right? So if they say it's significant, you can say it's significant. You can just sort of repeat that if you like. If you want to run the numbers yourself, you're welcome to. Um, in this case, you would probably um, using our rules of thumb, it wouldn't actually come out significant using our method, right? Um, and they explain why here, right? So you may recall one of the slides we sort of mentioned this when we were talking about statistics. When you get really low values, when you get out towards the sort of tails of the distribution, you have like 0% of something, the margins of errors start to get smaller than are actually in our usual rules of thumb, right? They get a bit distorted, right? And so we haven't provided you all that or all those tables, right? So that's why if you ran these numbers, you they would overlap a bit um, based on our rules of thumb and our tables, but the reason that it's actually still significant, even though it would seem not to be from our sort of quick and dirty and table methods, is because of what happens when you're all the way at 0%. Okay, so the big takeaway from that is like, yeah, if in the peer-reviewed study they say it's significant at a very high level, um, just believe them, right? Don't think that you're catching some statistical error. You're not. Okay, so and then step 6, summary. Uh, Clearly a careful study in line with random sampling models, right? The report indicates we could raise the confidence level to 99%. Remember, it was significant at 0.003 level, right? So very significant. So we're good. Very strong evidence in favor of the causal hypothesis that saccharin is a positive causal factor for bladder cancer in rats, right? Um, and here's, if there's any potential issues with this study, it would probably be issues with applying the result to humans. So here is the figure again. We saw it a moment ago, right? But in the process of doing this, you might draw this out. Okay, one point about this issue of applying this study of rats to humans. Right? So, the hypothesis, as we stated, is just about rats, right? Um, so there's obviously some controversy about how to apply that knowledge to public policy regarding humans. Um, Rats are not humans, right? Obviously, and secondly, the rats were fed quite a bit of saccharin. So 5% of their daily diet was saccharin, which is the equivalent for a human of 800 bottles of soda a day. So far more than any human would drink. Right? So why give the rats so much, right? Isn't that sort of a big flaw in the design? Um, well, it's a good sort of proxy for what we get in the real world. So in the real world, right? Yeah, not everyone who eats saccharin or smokes is going to get cancer. Um, but when you got so many people in the world, right, engaging in these sorts of activities, even if a very small percentage of smokers get cancer or a small percentage of saccharin eaters get cancer, it ends up being a lot of people, right? We've seen this sort of thing with COVID-19. Even if 1% of people get really ill, well, in a country of 300 million people, that ends up being a lot of the 3 million people, right? So you could do the study that way, which would be, I guess, more realistic, right? You feed thousands of rats relatively small doses, right? And then see what percentage develop cancer. But just doing a study with thousands of rats is really sort of so it's a generally accepted practice that you can sort of substitute a larger dose for a larger sample, right? So I don't want to feed 1,000 rats a little bit of saccharin every day, maybe the equivalent of 2 cans of soda or whatever. So I'm going to take a smaller sample and feed them the equivalent of 800 cans of soda. And it's generally accepted that it works out roughly the same. Um, Now there is a reason that wouldn't be the same if there was a threshold effect, right? So a threshold effect is like maybe it's possible that cancer is only triggered really big doses, right? And somebody who drinks normal doses for the rest of their life would never pass that threshold, right? Um, but so far as we can tell, there's not a lot of these sorts of threshold effects in biology, right? All the effects we see seem to be a bit more sort of linear, right? And as for whether rats are similar enough to humans to draw conclusions about the effects of saccharin, um, I mean, so far, all the substances that we have found to cause cancer in humans also cause cancer in rats. So that's interesting. Of course, it's different from the claim that every substance that caused cancer in rats would cause cancer in humans, right? Which would be the inference you would maybe want if you wanted to take this study and apply it to humans. Um, but it's suggestive enough that there's not really a good reason to think that saccharin would somehow be an exception to this correlation we see, right, between cancer causing agents in humans and cancer causing agents. Um, so it turns out that the cancer rate found in rats translates to about a 6 in 1 million chance that a human drinking a normal amount of soda will get cancer. Um, so it's a risk, but kind of a relatively small risk, right? They're small enough that it seems like um, a person can decide for themselves whether they want to drink soda and run that risk, right? So that's sort of a public policy decision. Um, that's probably why they just went with a warning label, right, instead of a ban of saccharin. Um, and that's a matter for chapters 9 and 10, where we'll talk about making decisions based on the evidence that we have. For now, right, we're just saying what sort of evidence can we even say science has given us? And in this case, science has given us evidence that there is a causal relationship, right? Um, and it's up to the policymakers using decision theory or whatever to what to do with that information. So a note about double-blind trials, you may have heard this terminology, right? So you really have to make sure that the only systematic differences between these two groups, the experimental control groups, are the causal variable. The one's getting the causal variable and one isn't, right? So, and experimenters typically are very careful about this. So, for example, like um, when there are studies that require an operation on the experimental group, uh, they'll give the control rats an operation as well that does nothing, but they'll still cut them open and so on, sew them back up, just to make sure that it wasn't like the cutting up and sewing back up that produced, right? Um, and then an experimental uh, in experiments on human subjects, we often use what we call double-blind studies. So this means that the subjects that are in the study, they don't know if they're in the experimental control group, right? So for example, if it's testing a medication, um, the experimental group will get the medication, and then the control group will get a pill that is nothing, right? It's placebo, a sugar pill or something, just so they don't know whether they're actually getting the medication or not. Because you've probably heard of the placebo effect, right? Um, just knowing that you're taking a pill and thinking you're getting medication will sometimes cause changes in your body, right? So some sort of psychological effect or something. Um, so, they'll take a sugar pill and be like, oh, yeah, my headache went away, right? That's a powerful sort of psychological effect. So they want to make sure that if they're doing anything to the um, right experimental group that is not strictly speaking the cause, right? So in addition to the medication, they're taking a pill, right? And they're seeing themselves take a pill. Make sure you do that to the control group as well. So that's just single blind. In double blind, the subjects don't know which group they're in, and also the experimenters that are doing like diagnoses or interacting a lot with the subjects, they also don't know which are in the control or the experimental group, right? Because particularly if they're doing diagnoses, right? So they're trying to decide, okay, is this effective for colds or whatever, and they have to evaluate symptoms, right, of the subject and decide whether they have a cold or not. Well, um, you don't want subconsciously their knowledge that they're getting the drug or not getting the drug to affect their right evaluation of the subject, right? Of course, there's somebody somewhere has to keep track of who's in which group, right? But those people shouldn't be really interacting with the subjects because they could subconsciously be treating them differently and subconsciously be um, tweaking the data. So you can actually, by using placebos, sometimes use the same group of subjects as both the experimental and the control group, just in different sessions over time, right? Depending on um, what the uh, depending on what it is. So if it's giving like a headache drug, right? Then yeah, for sure you could um, give one group the headache. They'll get one set of headaches, and you give them the experimental drug, see how it does, and then on another day or whatever, when they get another headache, give them a placebo, and that way the same people can be the control, and that's nice because it matches. Right, remember the residual state that we were worried about in the last lecture? Well, if it's the same person, basically same residual state. I mean, I guess your residual state can change over time a bit, but it's as close as you're going to get. But to having the exact same, right, two groups be exactly the same, use the exactly same people in both groups. Okay, well, that's enough. We're just over 50 minutes, so apologies for going a little long. Um, but yeah, uh, hit me up if you have office hours, if you have any questions or anything like that, and so on, right? Always here, always happy to help. Want to make sure you're all getting this. Okay.